All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist in my ongoing series on German philosophy from the 18th century to the 20th century. And today I'm continuing my series on the great Jewish thinkers of this German tradition. And I've invited a special guest, Dr. Roger Berkowitz, who is a professor of political studies and human rights and the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. So I'm very happy to have Dr. Berkowitz here, whose area of specialization is both law, political theory, and continental philosophy, and is also the author of The Gift of Science, Leibniz and the Modern Legal Tradition, and editor of The Perils of Invention, Lying, Technology, and the Human Condition, which I think started in 2021. And also, every Friday, Dr. Berkowitz has a virtual reading group on Hannah Arendt, and there's also a podcast that goes along with this. And apparently, it's very, it's rigorous. And so I'll put all the links for that in the information on the video. And first and foremost, welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Chris, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, as I said before, this series is also to focus on the important Jewish thinkers. And today we're talking about Hannah Arendt, and I'm so happy to have, someone that works at is the research and director of the Hannah Arendt Center. How did you start this? Since you're both the founder and the director of the Hannah Arendt Center, how did you get involved with all of this and starting this?
Oh, that's okay. That's a long and funny question, but it's a very Arendtian question because it was completely by accident. Arendt, I think, is known for her thinking around freedom and natality. That we humans are always more free than we think they are, and that there's a spontaneity at the very core of what it means to be human. I studied mostly Martin Heidegger and German continental philosophy, along with Greek philosophy in graduate school. My first book was on Leibniz, as you mentioned, and it didn't mention Hannah Arendt. But I always read Hannah Arendt and was a big, always enjoyed reading her quite a bit, and in grad school had a couple of courses on her and also reading groups that I organized with some friends on her. But when I came to Bard College, Hannah Arendt is buried at Bard for a whole host of interesting reasons, and she left her personal library to Bard. And so when I came to Bard, I decided I should maybe, get back involved in my Arendtian interests. And then I was invited to give a talk somewhere, and I gave a talk on Hannah Arendt and in a sense rethinking my dissertation on my first book, The Gift of Science, from an Arendtian perspective. And after the talk, I went back to Bard and met with the president and said, we have this collection, we have her grave, we should probably do something to sort of to announce it to the world, because it hadn't really been widely publicized. And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know, I'm not an Arendt scholar, but I really like her work, so let's do something. And I said, let's have a conference. It's her 100th birthday. It was 2006. She was born in 1906. So I said, and he said, great, spare no expense. I said, great. Where do I get the money? He said, no, raise the money, spare no expense. So, I wrote a couple of letters. I raised about $11,000. And I then wrote to a number of people I knew. The idea was to not do an academic conference on Hannah Arendt, but to ask some of the smartest people I knew to come and say why Arendt mattered in their lives. And I separated into a number of questions. What does Arendt say about freedom? What does she say about her Jewishness? What does she say about, totalitarianism or evil? And I, had a bunch of questions, and I invited, people that I wanted to hear talk about it who weren't necessarily Arendt scholars. And it was an extraordinary conference. It really was. It was one of those magical 2 days, packed auditorium with 300 or 400 people. It just went really well. And after the conference, her literary executor, Jerome Cohn, came up to me and said, I've been to 100 conferences on Hannah Arendt. This is the one she would have loved. Would you take over the Hannah Arendt Center? And I said to him, I'm not a Hannah Arendt scholar. And he said, that's okay. You're doing what I think she would want. And I said, okay. I said, but it's not going to be a center dedicated to like memorializing her and having people come and write books about this sentence in her work or whatever. It's going to be about what I'm interested in, which is the public world. And he said, that's what she was interested in, and that's what she would like. And so, that's how it emerged. It's a center that's not, well, we do have her library and we do sponsor research on Hannah Arendt. I see the center as a place to nurture provocative, bold, fearless thinking, which is how I think of her work, independent thinking about the public world. And that's how the center has emerged, and it's grown and become quite vibrant in that way. And that's how it began.
Well, thank you for that very rich answer, and I loved hearing the insight behind the whole center. And I also liked hearing about yourself and getting to know you as well too. But it's interesting you brought up this really great question: why Hannah Arendt? And so I guess my first question to you is, starting off by introducing who Hannah Arendt is, and why do you think we should engage with her thought today?
It's a great question, and it's a great question because we have to start with a couple of things. One, she was a stateless refugee, right? For 17 years. She was arrested in 1933, stripped of her German citizenship, fled to France, made it to the United States 7 years later in 1940, became a citizen in 50. How many of the canonical thinkers were stateless refugees? You're not talking many. She was a woman, right? How many of the canonical thinkers were women? And how many were Jewish? Spinoza comes to mind, maybe Moses Mendelssohn. But the point I guess I'm trying to make is that in some ways, she was an outsider in this world. And in that sense, I think she's contemporary and modern, and yet she's also as much of an insider as you can get. She used to say that she had the entire corpus of German poetry memorized, and she largely did. One of the things that's fascinating is to read her both in English and in German. She translated most of her books back into German, but she didn't just translate them, she rewrote them. And what you see is that a lot of the strange formulations that she uses in English actually come from her thinking about German poetry, which then appears in the German editions. But in the English, it just comes as sort of slightly odd, but powerful expressions because it's coming from a poetic sensibility. She wrote about the world, right? She is, she denied being a philosopher famously in an interview with Günter Gauss, where he said, you're a philosopher. And she said, I have to correct you. No, I'm not. And he said, well, I'm going to insist that you are. And there's a kind of mansplaining going on there. But, she wasn't a philosopher, and yet she knew the history of philosophy. She studied with Martin Heidegger for many years. She was his lover. She studied with Karl Jaspers. She knew the history of philosophy inside and out. She read Greek. She read Latin. And so who is she? She's someone who, knowing the tradition of Western philosophy deeply, was profoundly aware of the break of tradition that the Holocaust was and is and remains, that we needed to rethink the world anew, and that she would write about things that happen in the world: the Holocaust, totalitarianism, modern education, race, civil disobedience, free speech. She would write about political issues, worldly issues, but informed by philosophy, and with no desire to create any kind of systematic philosophy. There is no systematic philosophy in Hannah Arendt. Each one of her essays is somewhat sui generis. That doesn't mean there's not consistencies, but it means that she really does look at an issue, figure out how she's going to approach it, pull out certain philosophers, certain ideas that she wants to take and run with, but works them into her own unique approach. I mean, when I started the center, I used to get almost every week an email from some young graduate student who would say, I have a new paper figuring out that Hannah Arendt is a Machiavellian, or I have a new paper that Hannah Arendt is our Marcusian, or I have one that says she's a Heideggerian or a Jasperian, and the answer is, this is great. She read all these people, she took a lot from them, but she is a powerful, unique voice. And I think a lot of people, maybe because she doesn't have a systematic philosophy, maybe because she's a woman, maybe for a whole host of reasons, they always want to say, who is she, right? Who was her influence? And she was unique, and she was powerful, and she was fearless. And I love all of those things about her. Because she wrote about Judaism and the Holocaust and freedom and the human condition and America and the American Revolution and the French Revolution and Eichmann in Jerusalem, and science. She's taught in so many different departments. I mean, she's taught in philosophy, but she's taught in politics, she's taught in Jewish studies, she's taught in history, she's taught in technology studies, she's taught in ed schools. And as a result, she's probably read by more than, honestly, I don't know of any other 20th century thinker who's as widely read as Hannah Arendt. I've asked this question to many people. I don't think there's anyone else. She has 3 books that are considered to be classics in different disciplines: Origins of Totalitarianism and sort of history, Eichmann in Jerusalem and Holocaust studies, Jewish studies, and the human condition in political theory. Who else has 3 different books in 3 different disciplines that are sort of masterworks? And then all the essays. Truth in Politics has become probably one of the most read and most taught essays in the last 10 years, just because of what's going on in the world. It was written 60 years ago. And, it gives you pause to think that what's going on with Truth in Politics is not new. So yeah, she's just someone who, whatever issue you want to think about today, you can find in her work not only mentions of it, that's ridiculous, but serious thought about it that helps you approach it and think about it in a new and original way. So every year, I'll end with this. Every year we have a conference at the Hannah Arendt Center around her birthday in October, and we pick a topic of relevance to the world, and then I try and situate it within her work. And everyone's always amazed. I'm amazed sometimes how powerful you can find powerful resources in her work to rethink questions of tribalism and cosmopolitans, question of friendship, questions of rage, questions of education, questions of civil disobedience. They're all there. And that's what's so fascinating and what makes her so timely today, because she really is someone, I think, that resonates with so many people and so many different people around the world. I guess there's one other thing I actually do want to say, Christopher, which is that she's not a conservative, but she's not a liberal. It's also incredibly refreshing to have someone who doesn't come at this ever from any kind of ideological point of view. She's always comes at it from her own approach, whatever that may be in this particular issue. And it's really unique.
Thank you for that answer. And this is why I'm glad that I'm doing this series and why I have you here to discuss Arendt's work and her significance. Because as you were talking, I could see the literal passion in your eyes, which is wonderful to see, actually. Now, you had touched a little bit about some events in her life, but I was wondering if maybe we could go through her life, give a kind of brief biography. It doesn't have to be exhaustive or anything. Just so we can frame maybe the major points of her life.
Yes, she was born in Germany in 1906. She was a Jew. Her father died when she was, I think, 5. She was incredibly precocious, and read, philosophy very early. She went explicitly to study with Martin Heidegger because, as she wrote later, that she heard that there was someone teaching that was making people think in a new way, and she wanted to go and study with him. She went down there to study with him. They had an affair. It's a famous affair. And then because they had this affair, he sent her to work with Carl Jaspers for her enigmatic 30-second description of that, which is really the only one we have in an interview with Günter Gauss. She says that the police officer who interrogated her had just been promoted from the criminal police to the political police. She was his first case, and he didn't know what to do with her. So she said she charmed him, and he let her go. And she left Germany, went to France, lived there for 7 years, worked for the Youth Aliyah, bringing people to Palestine, young German Jews to Palestine, also working for other German Jewish organizations. Then was put in a concentration camp in Gurs, and walked out one day and made it to Marseille, where Varian Fry helped her escape through Portugal, made it to the United States, began writing for Aufbau and other German Jewish publications about war, about the war, about Zionism, about Jewish politics mostly, and other things. And then wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, which came out in 1950, which obviously made her quite famous. It is one of the greatest books ever written, up with a book of essays, Between Past and Future, which is, I think, an extraordinary book and probably an undervalued book in her corpus. The Human Condition, also in 1958, which is a classic in political theory. And then went and wrote to Wallace Shawn of the New Yorker, and it said when Eichmann was kidnapped and arrested in Argentina, and brought back to Israel for trial, and said, "Look, I left Germany before I got to ever meet a real Nazi, and I want to meet one in the flesh," she said. And so the New Yorker sent her over to the Eichmann trial. She was there for the first 2 weeks of the trial. Then she left and then came back for the end of the trial. She spent 3 years immersed in the transcripts and reading about it and reading him and reading about it. And then wrote this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, first in the New Yorker, then in book form, which on the one hand has become probably, has to be one of the most read books about the Holocaust in history. And I think one of the best, and yet also one of the most controversial, and led to an enormous personal crisis for her, in the sense that a lot of her closest friends forsook her. 12 years of her life doing a mixture of journalism, and also working on a book called The Life of the Mind, which she never finished, and then died in 1975 in New York. She never held a full-time tenure track position. She never wanted to. That's the outskirts of her life, or the outline of her life.
And now I know you said earlier that that Arendt is really on her own. She's influenced by many, but she really is a true thinker when it comes to her, original thinker. But if you had to pinpoint maybe some of her philosophical influences, and they can be literary too. You could bring up the poets as well too that you'd brought up earlier. Who would you say are her philosophical or poetic influences that are in her writings or inspire her in a sense?
There's so many, and it's beautiful because she really does. She has a wonderful essay on Walter Benjamin, who was a very close friend of hers. When I told you she was in Marseille, she was in Paris and then Marseille and then escaped through Portugal. Benji, as she called him, she and Benji used to play chess regularly in Paris, and um, he didn't make it out, right? Famously, he got stopped at the border between Spain and Portugal, and committed suicide, and she had to let people know, Gershom Scholem and others. But in a wonderful essay about Benjamin called, she has this metaphor in it of pearl diving, which is that you dive into the past and you pick up little treasures, little pieces, pearls, and that you make into your own, and you shine them and make them into your own. He wasn't a systematic thinker, and in many ways she wasn't either. So she took things from Benjamin, she took things from people, and let them form into what she wanted them to be. I mean, clearly one of the most important influences in her life was Martin Heidegger. You can't deny that. I mean, I think she would have said Martin Heidegger taught her how to think. Heidegger's distinction between thinking and knowing, his idea that thinking was an activity in which one was almost ecstatic. I mean, for Heidegger, this idea of standing out in a clearing with being, right? Arendt took that seriously. She didn't stand out in a clearing of being, but she says that thinking is transcendence, just like Heidegger. But instead of transcending into the clearing of being, for her, thinking is transcending into the world, and into the world with others. And when you transcend into the world with others, you have to listen to them. And you have to test your own thinking against theirs. And you have to therefore challenge your own thinking. And that's going to require, since you're always a perspectival being, and this she takes from Heidegger, but also from Nietzsche, since you're a perspectival being, your perspective is not true. It's just one of trillions, billions. And so then when you transcend out into the world and you encounter other opinions, you change yours, you hope they change yours, and you develop what she would call a common sense. Common sense is not what everyone thinks. It's not what already people think, but it's what we all think insofar as we challenge our own opinions against other people and come up with something that we can all agree on commonly amidst the transcendence into this public world. That's a mixture of Heidegger, Nietzsche, but also Jaspers, right? Another one of her main teachers, the idea of communication. Jaspers says truth is communication, that truth is an existential idea, right? And that for Jaspers, truth is communicated with both the living and the dead. And it's what holds us together. Arendt takes that deeply, but again, mixed in with Nietzsche, mixed in with Heidegger. Something one does both in solitude, but only in solitude insofar as you think in conversation with yourself. And then you also do it in public when you practice it between others. And she has this distinction between solitude and loneliness. In loneliness, we're just solipsistic, we don't think. But in solitude, we're actually in conversation with ourselves, and we try and actually put ourselves into conversation with others by bringing other opinions that we know from our reading and our experience into conversation with ourselves. So, Heidegger, Jaspers, Nietzsche, Benjamin, Kant. I mean, clearly Kant was an enormous influence on her in many ways, but precisely on this question of common sense, the Gemeinsinn, right? The idea that you have to test your own opinions in public, and in testing them, expand your opinions to reach out to a common understanding. She took from Kant, and she took his theory of judgment, his critique of judgment, as his politics, as this idea of how one reaches out across to others and seeks to test one's public opinions against them. So her essays on Kant's political judgment are crucial in that regard. You can find, I mean, Machiavelli was a big influence on her. In my own work, Montesquieu is a huge influence on her, especially Montesquieu's really profound insight that only power can check power. that laws can't check power. So in her political writings, and especially in her book on revolution and her thinking about constitutional law, this insight of Montesquieu's that politics is about power, not about laws, and that the point, if you want to prevent totalitarianism from coming into being, the way to do so is not to create laws that prohibit it, because those are what she calls paper tigers. You need to create multiple sources of power so that if one power source gets too powerful, others can join up and resist it. And that deep insight of Montesquieu's into politics and the spirit of the laws is one she takes deeply seriously. She takes that some degree from Montesquieu, but also from John Adams and some of the American founders who she read very closely in their constitutional thinking in the 18th century. There are others too, but those are some of the primary influences that just come to mind. And I think it really is important to remember that she's influenced by all these people. Plato, obviously, enormous, and Aristotle, her idea of friendship, her idea of plurality, deeply Aristotelian. She's in a certain sense negatively influenced by Plato. She finds Plato's interest in unity and interest in truth or correctness, ta orthos, over and against the opinion, the doxa, to be the end of politics and the great mistake that Plato introduced into philosophy, which is to seek an idea of truth as opposed to an embrace of an opinion. So all of these thinkers are sort of wound up in her own work, and that's what I love about her, is that you can find these echoes all through her work, but in the end, you really do have to read her.
Yeah, that's a really, really nice analogy. You said all these echoes, but you really need to read her. And I really like that. There's so much influence there, but also she's writing in her own voice, which is very nice.
Yeah, if you read her Denktagebuch, which is it's about to come out. I hope it's going to come out in English at some point, but it's a diary of thoughts, a Denktagebuch that she kept from about 1950 until about it starts to really fade off around 1965, 1966, almost 15 or 16 years. But you can see, certain months where all she's doing is reading Nietzsche, or all she's doing is reading Plato, and she's copying text down, she's writing her own thoughts about them down. And you can see what she's taking from a lot of these thinkers, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Plato, or some of the big ones in the Denktagebuch.
So I guess I was wondering if you could perhaps outline maybe the main thesis of Arendt's very, most popular piece, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And does this early work have any clear relation or overlap with Eichmann in Jerusalem?
Okay. Yeah, clearly it has some overlap with Eichmann in Jerusalem, although in complicated ways. So let's see if I can get there. It's a 550-page book. I teach it every year. I also have taught it 3 times in the virtual reading group, and we have a podcast on it. So it's a book that, it gets richer and richer every time I teach it. I also love it simply because if you know Arendt well, almost every other book and essay she ever wrote is in situ in that book. You can find it all there. And it's sort of like a treasure trove of mysteries and small hints of what's to come throughout her work. But what is the book about? She says it's about trying to comprehend, to understand. She says that comprehension is the attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. I love that line. It's one of my favorite lines in all of her work. Comprehension is the attentive facing up to and resisting of reality of whatever it may be. And she's trying to face up to and resist the reality of totalitarianism. It's very simple. For her, totalitarianism is something radically new. There's never been totalitarianism before the 20th century. We've had democracies, we've had oligarchies, we've had aristocracies, we've had monarchies, we've had tyrannies, we've had dictatorships. We had never had totalitarianism. Why? Well, what is totalitarianism? It is a form of government that more than any other fundamentally denies freedom. Right? Tyranny, she says, denies some freedoms, but you're still, in most tyrannies, you're allowed to sit at your home and read what you want to read and think what you want to think and talk to your friends. As long as you don't organize against the tyrant, you're not usually going to be bothered. Totalitarianism is something different. It's trying to get inside your head. It's trying to tell you what you can and can't think. And it destroys not only public life, but also social life and private life, and social and private freedoms, as well as public freedoms. And she said that was new. That was something that had never happened before. And we had to face up to that, the utter elimination of freedom. And the other part of it was the making of certain people fully superfluous, right? People who just could be killed, not because of what they did, but en masse, simply because of groups they belong to. Jews, but also gypsies, some communists, others. And so it meant that you had there was no innocence, right? People could be killed for any reason. And so this, she said, was new, and we had to face up to this newness and its horrors. And so how do you face up to it, and how do you resist it? Well, she says you have to understand where it comes from. You have to comprehend it. The word origin is a poor choice. It's not one she liked. Her title for the book was The Burden of Our Time. But the press put it out there, and it's stuck, and we're stuck with it. But what she says over and over again is that what the book is about is not the origins of totalitarianism, but the elements of totalitarianism. The different elements that she said, each one matters, and each one was part of it, but not one of them explains it all. They have to come together in some crystallized form that the elements come into, that totalitarianism emerged. She never gives like a final list of what she thinks these elements are, but I think if you go through her writings, you can find a number of them. Some are racism and anti-Semitism. She says, look, most people think that anti-Semitism, was sort of an accidental thing, and that we shouldn't take it seriously as part of the rise of totalitarianism. But she says, no, you have to take it very seriously, and you have to ask, why the Jews? And that, question itself is controversial, because it's saying that there's a reason for the Jews. Some people would say that's called blaming the victim. She doesn't think so, and I think she's right. She's not blaming the Jews, but she says you have to ask why the Jews, right? And you can't just think it's an accident or whatever. And so racism, anti-Semitism, and she thinks of anti-Semitism as a form of racism, was part of it. Bureaucracy. I mean, we don't often think about this, but she was a huge critic of bureaucracy. Even in the 1960s, one of the main topics of her writing in the 1960s is the danger bureaucracies pose to liberal. Chapter called Race and Bureaucracy, about the way bureaucracies give power not to people, but to bureaus that are not responsible, and also avoid general rules or laws, because they want to be able to accomplish things outside the law. And so she thinks bureaucracy and the rise of bureaucracy through colonialism and imperialism brought back into the European nations was a big part of one of the elements of totalitarianism. Another was imperialism. The general principle of imperialism is expansion, that we want to constantly grow. She says politics requires limits. It requires moral limits, ethical limits, but also we need a, we have a state, and we don't want to constantly get too big. We need a certain kind of stability that allows us to be comfortable with who we are in our economic, social, religious lives. Imperialism, which is constantly expands, leads us to constantly need to grow, which means we need justifications to grow, which leads to ideologies and leads to a kind of world domination, an idea of world domination. And she says it's not an accident that both the great two totalitarian countries, Nazi Germany and Bolshevist Russia, were internationalist countries that sought to take over the world. Another element is the rise of the bourgeoisie. And she is scathing in her critiques of the bourgeoisie. But the overarching claim is that what the bourgeoisie seeks above all is power. Power, and as they seek power, there are no limits to the amount of power. And this is actually a very Nietzschean thought. In the will to power, there are no limits. And she thinks of Hobbes here as the great philosopher of the bourgeoisie, and she has these great 10 pages on Hobbes and his connection to imperialism and the replacement of reason and limits with power that is unlimited in its drive. Another element is the decline of the nation state. She thinks that nation states are paradoxical because on the one hand, a state has to treat everyone equally. But a nation state, if it's a German state or a French state or an Indian state or an Israeli state or an American state, has a national people. And those people are always going to be the first-class citizens, and there's always going to be second-class citizens. And so the national aspect of the state stands in tension with the state aspect of the state, where everyone is supposed to be equal. And this decline of the nation state leads to the fact that all minorities become a problem in nation states. And she says there's only three solutions, right? Expulsion, assimilation, or murder. And this is the problem that the nation state presents to us that she takes deeply seriously. Then there's terror and ideology, which are, terror is the essence of totalitarianism, and ideology is sort of what undergirds it. And then finally, the last, and I think for her, the element of totalitarianism that makes all of the rest possible is the rise in modern life of the new idea of what she calls metaphysical loneliness. She says loneliness is an old idea. We've always had people who are lonely, but in most times, loneliness was something that was only suffered by people who were old or sick, or the exceptions. Most people felt like they had a meaning or purpose in their lives. The problem with the challenge of modern life is with the retreat of religion, the retreat of tradition, the rise of the Enlightenment, the idea that we are all free. So many of us feel, she thinks, and I think she's right, purposeless. We feel like our lives don't have a purpose. And when we really, and that's fine if we're comfortable and if the economy is good and we have houses and we have rent, but in times of stress, that lack of purpose makes it very hard to feel like life is worth living. And so we seek a purpose in ideologies, in movements. And, whether that movement is Nazism or Bolshevism, whether that movement is, today, anti-colonialism, environmentalism, wokeism, whatever, there are all sorts of movements, MAGAism, and so these kind of movements become deep wellsprings of validation for our identity, such that we'd rather believe in these movements and their fictions, their coherent fictions that give us purpose, than address the reality of the world in which there are a sense of purposelessness. And so those are some of the elements. There's more. I think I could come up with others as well, but those are some of the core elements that underlie her thesis, that this thing called totalitarianism was new. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a certain the what she calls the break of tradition, the loss of traditions, the loss of religion, the loss of certain what she calls banisters. We're living in a time without banisters, and people desperately felt the need for these kind of ideological movements, these in a sense totalitarian movements. The Eichmann book, was her attempt to say, all right, well, now that I spent all that years thinking about totalitarianism, what happens when I look at one of these guys in the flesh and I read them and I take them seriously? And on the one hand, I think her encounter with Eichmann confirmed a lot of her thinking about this. He was a joiner. He embraced the ideology. And in many ways, she thinks of him as someone who who needed a purpose in life, and the Nazis gave it to him. One thing she thinks she realized she was wrong about is that she had thought that evil was still something that was monstrous. And what her encounter with Eichmann convinced her was that while he did evil, and he was clearly and he was someone who did it voluntarily and obediently and even with his own initiative, she thought he was terrifyingly normal. The word she ended up using was banal, thoughtless. By thoughtless, what she means is he was not someone who did what Kant and others said, which is stand out in the world and test your thoughts from the perspectives of others. She was just shocked that he could, speaking to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, say things like, there was death all around and I was suffering and it was so hard for me to do what I had to do, but it was my job and I had to do it. And she's like, how can someone say that to, a Holocaust survivor? She was just shocked. And she's like, the only way you can say that is you're so caught up in your own ideological worldview that you can't see out of it. You can't test your views against someone else. It's that kind of superficiality, that kind of thoughtlessness that she called banality. And what she said is that in the modern world, while there may be some people who are truly, monstrous, you can't do the kind of evil that Eichmann helped to accomplish, mass murder, without people who simply are thoughtless or banal. And that was her argument in the Eichmann book. And it's been controversial for many reasons. Some people have argued that she liked Eichmann, which is ridiculous, or that, she had utter contempt for him. She thought he was evil, but she thought his evil was of a particular kind. She sought to do in that book, and in that way, I think it both confirmed parts of the origins of totalitarianism, but also in her actual understanding of evil, there's no doubt, as she admitted many times, she changed her mind. She thinks that evil is now not something that is extreme, but is something radical in that its sense. It goes to the roots of thoughtlessness.
Well, I have to thank you for that, because that answer was very thorough, and you really helped navigate us through both those texts, I think, which is fantastic, and great for those that are not well versed with Arendt. Now they have a lot more to grapple with. I had messaged you earlier, and you had stated that, in your opinion, On Revolution and Between Past and Future are some of her most important works. And I guess my question to you, because unfortunately, I haven't read them, why do you think they are so important when it comes to Arendt studies or her actual work?
Well, again, it depends what you're looking for when you read Hannah. Her political philosophy, in sort of a theoretical sense, I think a lot of people turn to her book, The Human Condition, which I should also say is also one of her most important books, and I truly love. And in that book, she develops a number of concepts. So, labor, work, and action. And there's been a lot written about those three things. And, they're interesting and important. But in the end, I don't think they're, absolutely, I think they're heuristics. They're helpful to understand the world and her. But in the end, I mean, they're not key, I think, to understanding her relevance in the world today. Her critique of science in the human condition, I think, is profound and important, but again, pretty abstract at times. So take a book like On Revolution, which is the last book she finished. She published both On Revolution and Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1963, the same year. Sort of extraordinary to publish two books of that quality in the same year. But On Revolution is a book about revolution. And it compares in her mind, the two great revolutions of the modern era, the American and the French Revolution. And she's arguing that while most revolutionary scholarship and thinking has turned to the French Revolution, in fact, the one that actually was closer to succeeding in founding freedom, which she thinks is the goal of a revolution. So part of the argument is, what is a revolution? Her argument is that a revolution is not necessarily violent, although it can use violence. It's not necessarily forward-looking. It's a revolution. It's circular. It's a return to the past or the principles. And in her mind, what revolution is about trying to found freedom, to make freedom something that is and can last. And she says that it was clearly the case that the American Revolution was more successful in founding freedom than the French. And so we should pay more attention to the American Revolution. And she contrasts both of them throughout. But her real interest in that book is, what does it mean? And is it possible to build a political world in which freedom is a meaningful and lasting reality? So if you're asking me why that book is important, is I don't think there's a more important question in the world today. And she, in that book, explains why she thinks the American Revolution succeeded to some extent. And then in the long final chapter, she explains why she thinks it ultimately failed. And if you take it seriously, you find in it real insights for how we should think about political life today and how we should, as citizens, think about our involvement in political life. She thinks that the great insight of the American Constitution and the American culture was that it was suffused with a belief and a confidence in power. Right? The Mayflower Compact, they came over, and on the ship, they stopped and they wrote up a constitution. She said, who gave them the right to write a constitution? These were mostly lower class people. They did it. And she said there was this, and then every city, every state, they made constitutions. They declared their right to govern themselves. And she said this was radical. This was new. And that then when the American Revolution actually happened, all 13 colonies went and wrote constitutions. And then they had the Articles of Confederation, and then you had the Constitutional Convention. And she's just impressed with and amazed. And she says there's no sovereignty in America. There's lots of sovereignties. There's cities, there's states, there's counties, there's the government. And instead of trying to find one sovereign, which is the way European nation states have been built, they were happy with diffusing power throughout institutions, throughout the society. And she thought that was brilliant, and partly accidental, but partly actually brilliant. And she goes through that history and tells that story. But she says it's one thing to create power because power means acting together to build a common world, which means freedom. But if you're going to make it last, you also need authority. And, you know, she said no one else could solve the problem of authority. And she talks about how in America, almost by accident, they solved the problem of authority by coming to believe in the Constitution and how the Constitution became this authoritative text. And it wasn't fully by accident. The founders actually imagined that the Supreme Court and the Constitution would be like the Roman Senate and appeal back to a beginning and to principles of foundation that would become an authority for the people. Again, she thinks it's failed in the end, but it does give us a lot to go on. And then in the final chapter, she says that the greatest mistake that the American founders made was that even though they were aware of the need of multiple power sources and diffusion of power through society and the lack of sovereignty, and even though they knew about the town hall meetings and about how people came together in local towns and decided whether to hire a policeman or hire a librarian or hire a teacher or build a road or build a school or build a jail, she said the Constitution doesn't give local government power. And she says that was the big mistake. And Thomas Jefferson actually writes a letter, two letters in the 19th century, saying this was the great mistake we made in the Constitution, is to not create a space for citizens, a constitutionally guaranteed space for people to come together and talk. And I think they're right. And I think the Arendt Center and me personally have been very involved in a movement in the last 5 years called citizen assemblies, where you're trying to create institutions where average citizens chosen by lottery are brought together to speak about public issues. And in a way, it's very much inspired by Ayn Revolution and her work and her belief that the only way to maintain a Republican form of government, small r Republican form of government, is by keeping alive citizen power. And that means having places where citizens can talk and engage with each other in institutions in which those opinions matter. All of which is to say, I think it's the book of hers that if you're interested in actually thinking through the possibilities and perils of freedom today, is the one you can grapple with and learn from. So I think it's just a brilliant book. Between Past and Future is a collection of essays. I think there's a lot, each essay has its own, there's the first 3 essays are on sort of more political philosophy. So, Plato and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others. Then there's essays on what is freedom, what is authority. And then there's some essays on the crisis of culture and the conquest of space and truth and politics, one of her most famous essays. But what I think is spectacular about this book is that all of the essays are what she calls exercises in thinking. They're not designed to come up with answers. They're designed to teach us what does it mean to think deeply about real political problems in a way that opens up new possibilities and in a way that fully confronts the utter horror of our times, and yet doesn't give in to cynicism and pessimism, and opens up ways of responding that are new. And that's what's beautiful about this book. They're exercises in thinking. And in a world in which we are so thoughtless and people are caught up in ideologies and everyone has to be either a liberal or a conservative, or they have to be, a Jew or a Muslim, or they have to be a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, or an American or a Chinese or a European or a Russian these days. Everyone's, you're not allowed to say things. You're not allowed to be creative. Everyone's being worried about say the wrong thing, right thing, blah, blah, blah. Her exercises in thinking are just mind-blowing. And I love teaching them because they really do exemplify what it means to think hard and deeply in an attempt to comprehend an issue without prejudice of where you're going with it.
Well, I just have one other question. It's kind of a follow-up because you brought this up. Are we all right for time? Just
Yeah.
you had brought, by the way, that was sensational, and I'm definitely going to check out that text. You had brought up the human condition. Now, this is from 1958. Now, this is a text I've actually read and was blown away. A friend introduced it to me because I had read her book on Augustine, loved that, and I wanted to read one of her core texts. And I just wanted to ask you, since what we had talked about was, on revolution and the coming together of these people through constitution, what is Arendt's idea of both agency and political freedom?
So the human condition, as she says, is an attempt to think what we are doing, right? This is the sort of fundamental approach to her. What are we doing? What's going on in the world? And she says, well, what we're doing is increasingly living in a scientific age. And as we live in a scientific age, the fundamental condition in which human civilization and human life has emerged over the last 2, 3, 4,000 years, however long it is threatening to change, right? We were earthly beings in the sense that we are, born and thrown into this world on this earth, and we can act together through political agency and change that world, but we can't fully rechange it. I mean, we're thrown into a world. It's a very Heideggerian idea, and yet suddenly, we're talking about test tube babies and designer babies, and we're talking about making new planets, and we're talking about going to the moon and building spaceships where people could live their entire lives in a humanly built environment, right? You never leave a spaceship. You never actually see anything natural. And she's saying we could live in a world in which the very conditions of our lives are humanly made, not natural, not divine, whatever you want to call it. And she says, if we continue down this path, we could remake the earth, remake the world, and remake humans artificially. And what will that mean for human freedom? What will that mean for action? What will that mean for, life, if we could live forever? What does human life mean if we can technically live forever? And these are the questions she's asking in that book. And so she has these 3 chapters on labor, work, and action, which she says are 3 of the faculties of the human condition, not the only 3, but she thinks they're the 3 that are most common. So, for example, she says another faculty of the human condition is thinking, but she says she's not going to talk about thinking because not everyone thinks, right? But everyone labors, works, and acts. And action is for her, to some degree, the highest of these 3 faculties, and it's the one in which freedom is most present, insofar as freedom for her is always public freedom. And this is one of her real insights, and I don't really know anyone who ever said it before her. Freedom is not free will. Freedom is not my ability to talk to you or read Arendt or read Heidegger or read Harry Potter. Freedom is public freedom. It's my ability to act and speak in the world so that people listen to me and pay attention to me. And when they listen to me and they pay attention to me, they can do a number of things. They can ignore me, which is the worst thing, right? They can arrest me. They can kill me. Or they can tell stories about me. And maybe those stories begin to change the world. That's natality, right? That's the ability that we're never imprisoned. We're never caught. And so what she's saying is that and by the way, she says this in the Origins of Totalitarianism. The only human right is not the right to live. It's not the right to eat. It's not the right to housing, because we're all going to die. I mean, she really does. I mean, people don't like this about her, but she says, look, you can't have a human right to life. We're all going to die. The human right is not to live. It's to be meaningful. It's to matter. And we matter and are meaningful when we are free, because when we're free, we speak and act in public and people respond to us. That's what it means to be human. To feel that when we say something, people are going to react. And so the human condition is about thinking of what we are doing, which is creating a world in which we may eradicate the human freedom, which has been what makes being human meaningful, for a long time. And she's like, we have to think what we're doing. We have to decide if that's what we want. Do we want to continue down this road of technological evisceration of human freedom, or do we want to freely resist it in some way? Now, you can't just resist. You can't just stop technology. And so what would it mean to resist it? And that's a good question. She never fully answers it, but I think the answer is something like, as long as you continue to think, and as long as you think what we're doing, and thus start new processes and start new human interventions, there's always that potential for free action and for a public world, and human freedom remains a meaningful possibility for humanity. And so that's what the book is about. It's a beautiful book. It has so many rich parts to it, but it is, it is a confrontation with the rise of technology and modern science.
Well, I want to thank you first and foremost for being here with me today, taking us through all of Arendt's work pretty much, and being so thorough, so passionate, and also what I really liked is making it practical as well as bringing it to real life, bringing her thought to real conditions and occasions in the world. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Berkowitz. And also, Dr. Berkowitz has a virtual reading group every Friday on Hannah Arendt, as well as a podcast, and I'll put links to those in the video. And thank you again for participating in my series.
It's been a pleasure. I really love your series, and keep up the good work, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.